have got some incredible training again today, starting off with our friend and colleague that I cannot say enough wonderful things about. Lori Rugle is the best person to share with you on so many aspects of gambling disorder, mental health, treatment, prevention, research, responsible gambling. She's worked with active military and veterans. She's worked with the industry nationally and internationally, and she has the biggest heart. If I were looking for a clinician, I would want to go to Lori because she listens, she's calm, she's patient, and she is the perfect person to talk today about how stigma and specifically how powerful our words are. And if we haven't learned that in the last 3 or 4 years, we've certainly learned that in the last 3 or 4 days and weeks. Our words have such power. And so we're excited to have Lori here with us today to talk about what that means in working with your clients and in working in prevention in our communities. So please join me in welcoming Lori Rugle. Take it away, Lori.
Well, Marie, now that introduction got me crying first thing in the morning. That was so sweet. Thank you so very much. And welcome all you West Coast early risers. Let me share my screen and see if I can get the right thing pulled up here. There we go. That's what I want. And this is one of my really favorite topics. I probably say that about everything. I guess I have a lot of favorite topics. But certainly in my own practice, in my own mindfulness practice, really aware of how words, the words I hear, the words I speak, the words I think, resonate in my heart, in my soul, in my body, and especially those words that I don't think that much about. The words that we use a lot, the words that we use, quote, without thinking, they resonate, they leave a residue, they create pathways that operate outside of, my frontal lobe consciousness that impact how I respond, how I react. It's all that implicit bias stuff. The water I swim in, for me who, as I introduced myself yesterday, a white privileged boomer generation woman, I don't see the whiteness of the world in which I operate. The fish doesn't see the water in their tank, but it's there. It's the environment in which I live. And unless I intentionally look for that in terms of words, in terms of the impact of how those words fall on others, I loved, that whole montage introduction was just so moving this morning. Thank you so much, Evergreen, for that. How beautiful that was. But one thing that jumped out, where our privilege intersects with someone's oppression, where my words intersect with someone else's oppression, and becoming intentional, becoming aware, in Jungian terms. And in my meditation practice, my teachers have us focusing often on identity, and not just the identity we, quote, identify with, that's we like, that's, we want to front, but the shadow part, in Jungian terms of our identities that we need to shine a light on in order to see. So, let's shine a light on this. And I have to say, I think I've gotten more pushback on this presentation than most that I do. So I'm really gratified for that. It's having an impact. From presenters who don't want to use more words than they need to when they're presenting and just want to simplify language, to, treatment professionals who like certain terms that they've used forever. And it's a nice shorthand. But some of our terms have become so common that they've lost meaning, that we don't understand what the impact really is and how they're landing. They've become so ubiquitous that we don't think about them anymore where we may need to. So with that as an intro, let's get into this. So words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. If you want to stigmatize something, you call it the China virus. And realizing that words can do harm. They can be killing in so very many ways. Or they can be nurturing, but we have to think about which we want them to do. Watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become actions. Watch your actions, for they become habits. And watch your habits, for they become character. And your character becomes your destiny. And over the years that I've quoted this, I've realized that it's been attributed to just about everybody, from the Buddha to Margaret Thatcher. And I kept getting corrected when I would attribute it to one person. So I looked it up finally and realized, oh, everybody said this. So thank us, everybody. And this is how words seep into our destiny, not only as individuals, but as collectives, as a society. And really thinking about the words we hear in the media, from our leaders, from our teachers, from our clients, from ourselves. So, this popped into my head once as I was preparing for this presentation. Why are self-help groups for those with addictive disorders and their concerned others anonymous? We just accept, oh, Gamblers Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous and, Gamanon, it's all anonymous. Why? Why do we continue to do that using only first names? And feel free to, put your answer or thoughts on that into the chat. It not because we're proud of belonging to these organizations, not because we want our names put out there in neon lights saying, yes, I'm a member of Al-Anon or Gamanon or Gamblers Anonymous. It's because it scares the living bejesus out of us if somebody else would know. That's shame and stigma. Yeah, so much stigma. It can be dangerous. I've had the privilege of doing some work with folks in Japan, and in Japan, they don't even use their real first names. It's so shameful, and they're so afraid of being outed. They make up names for themselves when they go into a Gamblers Anonymous meeting. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. Another thing that came through my computer when I was putting this together a few years ago was this news article. The gambling nuns of Torrance, California. Thou shalt not steal unless you're one of the Vegas-loving nuns who allegedly took the Catholic school under their watch for every penny they could. A Southern California community reckons with an altogether new form of churchly hypocrisy. And just let your eyes, as long as you can take it, take in all the elements of this picture and what that is saying, what messages are embedded in this picture, and just what feelings that leaves you with. Yeah. There are some members, somebody said, Julia says, their first and last name in meetings because anonymity was never designed to protect us from the world, rather the world from our egos. Bless you, Julia. I love that. I love that. Yeah. As someone in recovery, at the beginning of recovery, there are dangers to acknowledging the label to employment. Absolutely, it's a reality. It's not like we're making up the stigma and the shame and the fact that there are real world consequences because of that stigma. Absolutely, absolutely. Really good comments. Thank you. But I was just infuriated by this article when I first saw it, and this picture I think is designed to elicit a feeling of disgust at these poor nuns. I was disgusted at the person who wrote the article. Never, ever once was there any sense of compassion or that these women may be struggling with something beyond their, capacity to manage, rather than just being disgusting and evil and wanting to hurt people. So the images, it's not just the words, but the images that may be conjured up around the words and the perceptions and the way addictive disorders are representative, including gambling disorder. And this is from Michael Botticelli, who was involved in the Obama administration on addiction and drug-related policy. These are issues and these are words that have a dramatic impact on both clinical care and about how medical professionals, how the whole healthcare system actually see and treat people with addiction, how addictions are treated in terms of public health. And we all know, if we've been working in the field of problem gambling for a while, how gambling is ignored in terms of a public health issue often. And is it really because it's seen more as bad behavior, that people have volitional control over, rather than part of a whole public health structure? A starting point for thinking about these issues, and this comes from the book called The Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu and his daughter, out of their experience with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Just think about, coming out of this perspective as a starting point. No one is bad. And you may think about the people who are your challenges in thinking along those lines. No one is bad. None should be defined as a sum total of our worst actions. of our worst behaviors, of our worst days, months, or years. None of us is an offender, liar, betrayer, or monster. We are all fragile and flawed humans who may lie or steal or betray. When we do these things, we are not monsters. We are human beings who have become separated from our own goodness. You know? And, as we go ahead, think about the words you've heard applied to individuals who have a gambling problem or their loved ones, and how those may land in a person hearing that about themselves or others hearing that about this individual. And how have you been labeled? How do you label yourself? Think about from childhood on, what labels have been applied to you? Which have you liked? Which have you not liked? And how do you label yourself? If somebody, and if you ever have to do a brief bio, usually we label ourselves by what we've done, what we're proud of, or if you're in a self-help group, hi, I'm Lori, I'm a recovering psychologist. I'm a recovering human being. I'm a recovering person who's in relationship with those with addictive disorders. How do you label yourself? And how does that land? How does that resonate? What ripples are created by that label? And so, of course, as I was thinking about that for myself, I thought about how I label myself. And it came in the context of how I describe myself to Uber drivers, what I text in. I'm a little old gray-haired lady in a black coat. And then I started thinking about that. I hadn't really thought that much about that. Is that how I really want to label myself? Is that how I want other people to perceive me? So I went in and I Googled little old gray-haired lady, and this is what came up: Maxine. And this woman who's clearly having some difficulties with stability, with balance, with osteoporosis, kind of slowly making her way. And that's not me yet. That's not how I want to be perceived at this point in my life. So I said, what's a better way? So I Googled petite silver-haired older woman. And, these weren't what first came up. It was a bunch of pornography sites. Yikes, I tried to get it off as quickly as I could, but who knew it was a thing? You learn something new every day. Finally, when I got brave enough to go back in, and search around past the initial things that popped up, I got some images that felt, maybe a bit more consistent with how I want to see myself, more alive, more energetic, less impaired. So how we label ourselves can be an interesting exercise. When we stop and think more deeply about it. Don't just accept the words that just fly out of our mouths. And thinking about, as I mentioned, what words have you heard, seen clinicians, researchers, advocates, presenters, those in recovery use to describe their clients, their subjects themselves? Maybe think back. Were there ever any words used in presentations or in conversations that gave you a little bit of pause? It was quick, so, you just kind of went on in the conversation and you may not have stopped to really think about it. And, very, very recently, I've reviewed PowerPoints and I've heard presenters refer to the characteristics of a person with a gambling disorder as being a liar, a manipulator, a con man, a con woman, irresponsible, immature. And, if we were all together, if I switched to our, little boxes view and asked you, and you can chat in, feel free, are you a liar? Raise your hand. Well, the answer to that is we all are. Now, one study I read that the average person lies 3 times a day. Now, we call it something else, little white lies, being nice, being kind, all that kind of stuff. But everybody lies. And if I say I'm a liar, is that the totality of me? Yeah, I love it when a client comes in and says, I'm being 100% honest. Well, of course I know they're lying. No one is ever 100% honest. It's a skill that we could keep getting better at. So if I'm at 100%, that means there's no room for improvement, no room for deeper understanding. I can always get a bit more honest and deepen that process. And the best we can do is recognize when we can get a bit more honest. One comment during a presentation I gave to probation officers, someone in the audience said to me that they are just scum, referring to those affected by gambling disorder. I stopped the presentation and changed it to a general awareness about stigma. Wow, yeah. I've heard some interesting things from people, participants in trainings that, were a challenge, it was a challenge to respond to without being angry. Yeah. There's always room to grow. Isn't that lovely? There are more possibilities to learn about myself and become more honest. And to see when I do any one of these things, and if I put that label on you, and these are nouns, a manipulator, those are kind of solid, inflexible things that put people in boxes, and we'll talk more about that. And thank you all for your comments. Let me see if one more came in. Yeah, how about I am a well-intentioned prevaricator? Just a fancier way of putting stigma. Yeah, or just the term addict. Yeah, well, you guys are ahead of me as usual. So let's look at some of this research on stigma and gambling disorder, that we're beginning to talk about. This one research study, they gave this description of this person and then asked people to, characterize this person. Dan is a man who lives in your community. During the last 12 months, he started to gamble more than his usual amount of money. He's even noticed that he needs to gamble much more than he used to in order to get the same feeling of excitement. Several times he's tried to cut down or stop gambling, but he can't. Each time he's tried to cut down, he became agitated and couldn't sleep, so he gambled again. He is often preoccupied by thoughts of gambling and gambles more to try to recover his losses. Dan has also lied to his family and friends about the extent of his gambling. Now, for those of you who, have been involved for a while, you know what this is exactly. What is this a perfect description of? Feel free to chat that in. What does this description perfectly outline? All right. Yeah, gambling disorder. It describes perfectly all the criteria of somebody experience a gambling disorder without saying that's what it's doing. So this is just a person who meets all the criteria, yeah, for having a gambling disorder. Yeah, Robert and Devona got it on spot. And then they rated Dan. And Dan was rated as impulsive, irresponsible, irrational, foolish, untrustworthy, unproductive, greedy, and antisocial. Now, none of those things was specifically described in that paragraph. But because of meeting the criteria, just objectively described, all of these other characteristics were implied about Dan. Antisocial and greedy, unproductive, which is very interesting because many people who've come into treatment with me, had gotten months and months and months and years of awards as most productive employee in the place. But these stereotypes just come with all sorts of assumptions attached to them. I was thinking this morning, it's kind of creepy how now when I go into email, if you experience this, you're typing and you start with a word and then it automatically fills in the whole rest of the sentence for you as if it knew what you were thinking, which it seems to, which is kind of creepy. But, that's how one word can trigger all of these assumptions in our own little, artificial intelligence in our minds. That's kind of the epitome of stigma and bias, that one word has all of these associations that automatically get filled in. Our brain automatically fills it in, just like, the email system fills in the end of my sentence. Which is scary because it keeps telling us you don't really have to think about it. You don't have to think about the words you use. We'll just put it out there for you. You can abbreviate everything. Let's just get it out fast and we won't have to think about it. So it's like our technological world is conspiring to get us not to think about what's going on, what we're saying, how we're saying it, how that affects others, and how it reinforces all kinds of thinking. All right, let me get back from my soapbox moment. But what was interesting in this other research, that they looked at terms and which were rated more negatively than others. And both the terms problem gambler and gambling addict had equally negative stereotypes. But what was really interesting, the term gambler also had the same negative associations, only somewhat less negative than the terms problem gambler and gambling addict. So this is what I cite when I have lovely, well-intentioned therapists, presenters, psychologists come up to me and say, well, can't I just say gambler? Or when I'm writing up my research paper, can't I just say gambler rather than person who has a gambling disorder? That's just too cumbersome. That just takes too much time. That's just too hard. Can't I, maybe at the beginning of my presentation, I'll acknowledge when I say gambler, what I'm talking about is a person with a gambling disorder or a person who gambles. Won't that be enough just to put out that disclaimer? And I say, no, not nearly enough. I'm sorry if you have to use a few more words in order not to do harm. Live with it. I get very hardcore about this, because if you're saying it, people are hearing it, and you're hearing it, and it's reinforcing these negative stereotypes because we're not thinking about it. Or we are thinking about it outside of our, forefront awareness in ways that are harmful to everyone. So language matters. Recovery dialects, positive and negative, a person who uses substances versus a substance abuser, recurrence of use rather than relapse, pharmacotherapy versus medication assisted, accidental drug poisoning versus overdose. And I really love that one because overdose, has a connotation of intentional volitional actions rather than I got something and I didn't know what it was and it was an accident. And a person with a substance use disorder rather than an addict, as somebody pointed out, addict, alcoholic, opioid can have stigma attached to them. Now, with my friends in recovery, we get into the discussion of, but that's what I want to call myself. That's fine with me. But, explore a little bit, be curious about how that really resonates inside of you. A person I respect immensely, Phil Valentine, who's head of CCAR, the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, really helped me wake up to many of these issues. And, the way he refers to himself is a person in long-term recovery, rather than an addict. He isn't that anymore. He is a person in long-term recovery. So when we really noodle around about what does that really mean, and is that what I really want to convey? Is that who I really am today? And how best can I represent that in a way that does no harm to me or to others? So, this brings us to person first language. When we talked about those Desmond Tutu where to start phrases, no one is bad. So I am a person first. I am a person who is dealing with these issues, with this disorder, with these problems. Person first. I'm not, I'm a person who has problems. I'm not a person who is a problem. That's not my identity. So I'm a person experiencing gambling problems. I'm a person who has a gambling disorder. I've had a recurrence of gambling. I'm a person in recovery, meeting my recovery goals. And when we get into the whole abstinence versus harm reduction or limited gambling debate, I can be a person in recovery and meeting my recovery goals, even if my particular goal at the moment isn't abstinence. So we have to create a space to talk about the whole continuum of recovery-oriented goals, rather than I am a problem gambler, as if I am nothing else, or a compulsive gambler, or a disordered gambler, or an addicted gambler. That's not putting the person first, and the disorder is something that's impermanent. My problems with this activity are not permanent. They don't define me. And that's really important for hope and looking towards change. And even words like clean imply words like dirty, which of course has all sorts of stigma. And if we label people, as we have seen, as Marlene mentioned, over the last certainly several years, we make them other. They're not me. And they are shunned. If I'm a Republican, I shun Democrats. That's all you have to say is you're a Democrat and you're an other. You're not me. You're not part of my clan, my tribe. Or if you're a Democrat, then you shun all Republicans. And we do this all the time. All of us do, to one extent or another. The best we can do is notice it. I'm othering again. Yeah, okay, I'll work on that. Let me take a deep breath, forgive myself, and send some loving kindness to those that I'm othering. For me, it means I'm outcast. And that's why it's so powerful to have self-help groups, because I get to come and be accepted where I'm not outcast and I'm not shunned. And that's such a powerful healing experience. Imagine if we could broaden that circle of where I am not shunned and excluded, or where I'm not deserving, or where I don't have a right to even belong to human society. And so many of our clients, because they've done some very harmful things, feel like they don't even have a right to be part of humanity. And our job as healers in creating healing environments is to say, yes, you do. You're welcome here. Come on in. You will be accepted. Not that your behavior will be condoned necessarily. There are amends to be made. But as we mentioned, we're not going to define you by the worst things you've done in your life. Changing language isn't just a, quote, politically correct or polite thing to do. Terminology can imply that problem gambling is a result of personal failure. And people in study after study tend to rate gambling problems as caused by, quote, bad character, immoral. Even if we've gotten away from, the moral model of addictive behaviors, that it's really sticky and it persists in terms of stigma and perceptions. Research shows that people with a gambling disorder are viewed negatively, as we've talked about, as perilous, non-recoverable. Would you want, in some studies, would you want this person living next door to you? No, they're dangerous. They're rated as more dangerous. That recovery isn't as possible, and they're likely to be disruptive. Most respondents in the study with Dan were unwilling to socialize with Dan. That's othering and shunning. When we can celebrate diversity, Maureen says, and respect differences, we can accomplish so much. It seems recently that we are becoming more and more polarized. It's hard to wrap my mind around. Yeah, it is. We're being, it's this language. And if you listen to the media, both Fox and MSNBC, and think about even the one you may agree with, how their language contributes to othering. And it's all over the media. No matter what your affiliations are, it's there on all sides, and we got to stop it. We have to stop it. It may sell, commercials, it may increase ratings because, yeah, go team. Yeah, this is my team. I'm going to watch this show. But think about it. Think about what you're feeding yourself. Is it possible to have these slides? Yes. Yeah, they will be made public. Yeah. Yeah. So implications that we're not even aware of. And our job is to be, kind of mindful warriors in our willingness to look at our shadow sides, to look more deeply, to take the time to understand to the core of our being how these words are landing on ourselves and on others. What was really interesting is it's not necessarily an easy fix all the time. This study from opioid use disorder research. No one single term can reduce all potential stigma biases. For example, using medical terminology, a brain disease, chronically relapsing brain disease, reduced people's ratings of how they rated the person being described in this way, at involving less personal blame. So if you said this person has a brain disease, others were less likely to say it's their fault. But it decreased ratings that this person could recover. It made them seem less recoverable. They've got a brain disease. Oh, that's really serious. And it also increased perceptions of dangerousness and that the person should be socially excluded. Oh, I don't understand brain disease. That sounds scary. I don't want, to interact with them. I wouldn't know what to do. They might lose it. And we have those associations. Non-medical terminology, that person first language, individual having an opioid problem, increased the perception that the person was to blame for the problem. But simultaneously, they were rated that their recovery was more likely and they weren't dangerous and did not need to be socially excluded. So, no perfect answers here. But just being willing to be aware. And let's see what Robert said here. A careful examination of Jesus and the apostles Paul's teaching on not judging others has indicated to me that they're not suggesting we do not recognize that someone has fallen short of a moral standard, but rather of not having contempt for one who has done so. Absolutely. Which very much seems to me to correlate to what, there's the example of, was it Pope Paul II, who was shot, went to the prison to visit and forgive the person who shot him. He didn't say, oh, and let him out. There were consequences to harmful behavior, but we don't shun this person and recognize, and the common phrase is, there but for the grace of God go I. When I was talking with with a group of friends, one person said, somebody said to me, not there but for the grace of God go I, there go I. No difference. But for the grace of God assumes that I'm different than that person. There go I. And when I heard that, that really hit me. And it was summertime before the pandemic struck. And when I'd be driving up and down the main drag in Mentor, Ohio, which is where I live, very often there was clearly this homeless person, with bags and backpacks, just walking down the street, and I had typically said there, and then I started seeing him and just for a moment, for a breath, thinking, there go I. And it was different. I connected with that human being in a very different, deeper way. No difference, no othering. So play around with how those things land for you. Even in terms of how you think of your clients. And put on your mindful warrior gear buckle up and be ready to very kindly and compassionately look deeper at, how might I be labeling these people? How might I be thinking about them? So we want language clearly, and I'm speaking to the choir here, that emphasizes hope and recovery. And the recovery community for years has been emphasizing this. And in the quote problem gambling community, clinicians, presenters, I think up until fairly recently, when we would tell stories about those who have a gambling disorder or their family members, we would often tell the most sensational, horrific stories to get people's attention, to get them to take it seriously. And I did it. So I know what the motivation was. It came from, quote, a good place. I'm not sure the impact was always positive, for a number of reasons, but it portrayed individuals with a gambling disorder in these really intense people capable of doing the most horrendous things that I couldn't possibly relate to. And that must make them other. And it wasn't a story of recovery necessarily. It was a story of all the horrible harms that can come from living with a gambling disorder. And we need to do better on that. Language that respects individual autonomy and choice, self-efficacy, and multiple pathways, that everybody has their own path through their recovery, and that deserves to be respected. And every person makes their own choice about whether or not to change, and in what ways change may come best for them. Language and stories that humanize gambling disorder, avoid the fear and blame that portray those who are suffering as other. And when we think about family members, language is important there too. What do family members hear when they reach out? Often at the point of deepest despair, most overwhelm, most confusion and hopelessness in their lives. Often the message we have traditionally given in the field of addictions: you're doing too much. You're an enabler. You're codependent. You need to kick them out. And they're hearing this from their family members, from their friends, for people who love them and care about them. Just stop it. Let them hit bottom. You need to give them tough love. Set those boundaries. Detach. Just think about, these are words we've all used in the field for years. Lots and lots of years. As if they were an answer. And, when I work with clinicians and do some supervision and they're talking about families, it is so common, oh, and I'm working with this spouse who's just an enabler. Done. End of story, as if that were all we needed to know. And I take a deep breath, and try not to get on my high horse, and, gently encourage some curiosity about what that word means and what we want to do with it, and what do you think the client might be hearing when they hear that word, which they will. It's out there in the water. It's out there in the meetings they will go to, in self-help meetings, in treatment centers, in the literature. How does that help them? If we stop and think about, Maureen says, how we would want others to describe us, talk about us in our less than perfect life moments. Yeah, it helps us stop and rethink what words we want to use in our field. Absolutely. What stories would I want out there about me? There's a lot that I don't want out there, I'll tell you that much, no doubt about that. So again, stigmatizing unhelpful language, codependent. a person who has a loved one with an addiction. Enabling using unhelpful ways to respond to addictive behavior, or using behaviors that reinforce excessive gambling. Tough love, courageous, firm compassion, allowing somebody to experience natural consequences of their behavior. Detachment, perhaps equanimity and self-compassion. Detachment gets often linked to, consciously or disconnect. I have to shut down and not care in order to detach. That is often what happens with people as they respond to somebody who needs to feel more connected with others when they enter the recovery process or try to live through their addictive behavior. And looking at what I'm doing. And when you think about it, most people would respond to seeing a loved one suffer by trying to end that suffering and doing all the things that most of us would do in facing a loved one with an addictive disorder. That's not abnormal. It's not pathological. It's not diagnosable. It's understandably human. And that's the message, and what we don't talk about enough, and this is from Wilkinson Foote in their lovely book, Beyond Addiction. And the subtitle is something, how science and compassion can come together. What we don't talk about enough is the reality that it is normal to try and be helpful when someone you love is hurting themselves. It's normal to want to protect people we love from consequences of their behavior, especially when the outcome might be public humiliation, shame, incarceration, or death. Of course, you want to protect your loved one from that. Of course, you want to do everything that seems reasonable to do. And that's why we need help in figuring this out, because nobody ever taught us this, in kindergarten or elementary school or graduate school. So there are ways of responding that may be more helpful, but they take incredible courage, restraint, compassion for self and other. That's a training process. Another piece to think about is, what language do we use for talking about gambling without resulting in harm? Currently the term is responsible gambling, but a study that had lots of focus groups, including focus groups of folks who had lived with gambling problems, they didn't like responsible gambling because that implies irresponsible gambling. And so there's a stigma with that. Recreational or social gambling, or low risk gambling, safe gambling. Is any gambling safe is usually the comeback. Healthy gambling. Can gambling be healthy for some people and not healthy for others? Can some types of gambling or some ways, so can we educate people on these things? All grist for the mill. And I don't necessarily have the exact right words or phrases for this. And I think what's important is to realize what terms we use, especially with the industry, that put the onus on individuals versus putting some responsibility on the industry. This one study looked at, a focus on products versus a focus on the individual. And if we focused on gambling products, mandatory limit setting, the speed of games, percentage of losses disguised as wins or near misses. It's when, you're always winning at some combination of things on the machine, but you're never winning as much as you put in. Use of a stop button that does absolutely nothing except give people the illusion that they have some control over the outcome. Hours of operation, accessibility, availability, it's now on our phones everywhere we go. So the industry can take responsibility about doing some of these things that can reduce the harms of this activity. When we have a focus on the individual, which is the primary focus in responsible gambling programs, these currently. Information on how the odds work. So if I know how the odds work, I'll make rational decisions. If I have this disorder, I may not be in a position to make rational decisions. Or information on how the games work. It's important to do these things, but not exclusively. Providing treatment options. So if you have a problem, you have to go get treatment. Prevention messages, the individual takes responsibility. Personalized feedback, I'll tell you how much you're spending, how much time you're spending, and then you make the decision. And voluntary, non-binding limits. So we need a combination of these things, not just focusing on the individual, rather than regulating the industry. So I'm probably about out of time here, but think about and perhaps chat in one thing that was validated for you in this presentation, one thing that challenged you, or you learned or got you thinking in a little bit different way, and maybe one thing you're going to do differently or that you'll implement. And in the few minutes, maybe you could chat those in, or any questions that you might have. I feel like I should sing the, Jeopardy music here if I could sing. That would get everybody muting me. Anything that was validated. I said, yeah, I like that. That's the way I think. Anything you disagreed with or want to challenge me on? And let me stop let's see. Oh, yeah, I do have references and resources, some of the studies that I mentioned and the resources. The Center for Motivation and Change is a lovely site that has a ton of resources that are quite lovely for all sorts of things. Let's see what we've got here. Talking with family members about what they should be doing, implying that they're doing something wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Boy, and did I make all these mistakes? I came across as so judgmental of family members and trying to really prematurely get them to stop focusing on fixing their loved one to focusing on how screwed up they were, to basically. Oh my God, I'm so sorry to all those people that I worked with as a younger therapist. Appreciate the new terminology. What else have we got? Yeah, hi, Tony. Thank you so much. Link to activity break in 3 African drumming and therapy. Oh, that sounds so lovely. How exciting. The need to use discretion with kindness and graciousness with those in distress. Absolutely. Lots and lots of humility. I think the one thing I've done over the years is gotten more humble about how limited my impact is, and how limited my individual wisdom is, and how courageous and resilient and wise my clients are. Yeah. Thank you all for being here. And my favorite quote that is hanging on my wall: anyone can slay a dragon, he told me, but try waking up every morning and loving the world all over again. That's what takes a real hero. And you guys are all heroes. So pat yourself on the back. Make much of that. Give yourself credit. Notice all the wonderful, caring, compassionate, hard work that you do. Thank you so very much, and take really good care of yourselves. We need you. We need each other. Thanks, everyone.